let's talk a little bit about simplifying return statements in Python. So let me define a function which I'll call isOdd, and this function accepts a number, and then it's going to check if the number modulo 2 is equal to 1, because if it is, then the number is odd, and thus we should return true. Otherwise, else, we return false. Now let's take this for a spin. Isodd 42 should return false, Isodd 1 should return true. Right, so this is something I see beginners do quite a lot, and that is they use an if statement to decide whether to return true or false. And this is, well, I mean, the code works, right? We just saw that it works. The thing is, it's much longer and much more verbose than what is needed. There's a lot of code here that is not needed, and I'll explain to you why. And now, I'm showing you this. It's not because the goal in Python is to write as little code as possible. That's not just the point. Or I'm not saying that you should always write very little code. What you should do is write expressive code, and code that makes your intent as clear as possible. And thus I say that you should define this function as such. The function isOdd takes a number, and then it returns num modulo 2 equals 1. Notice that this is not new code. This code was already in the previous function. This thing we are returning is in here. It's the condition that was used in the if statement. And the return, well, there were two of those. Now what we're doing is we are unifying these two things, these two branches, because an if statement really represents a separation, because you're creating two different branches. It's a branch that runs if this is true, and a different branch, or a different branch that runs if this is not true. So if statements, they insert splits in your code, logical differences, whereas in here we are unifying the whole thing. It's checking if the number is odd. It's a simple return statement, and then we return whether or not num modulo 2 equals 1. Notice how the way in which you read this really influences how you perceive the code. The way I read this piece of code is we return whether or not num modulo 2 is equal to 1. And this is very expressive. It's very clear what it's doing. It's deciding whether or not the number is odd. It's deciding whether or not there is a remainder when we divide num by 2. And it's short, so your brain has an easier time understanding what's going on. It's equivalent to this, it's just that this takes more time to process. Right? And it's not noticeable because these are just 4 lines of code, and this is just 1 line of code, and the condition here is simple. But for longer pieces of code, when you have thousands of lines of code and maybe hundreds of functions, if you can make a simplification like this in a couple of places, you'll be making your life easier. Also, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but the best code is the code you don't write. So really, if you're just getting rid of some pieces of code that really don't matter, you should strive to do that. So, in conclusion, when you are using an if statement to return a Boolean value, you should look at how to take the actual condition and return that condition. That's how you can simplify your return statements.